In my opinion, college football is the best sport in the world. Nothing comes close to touching it in terms of the excitement and the passion these fans have for their schools. And for years now, we have obsessed over ranked wins. That is, how many top 25 opponents did your team beat? It's one of the go-to talking points in debates, especially surrounding the college football playoff and the rankings. But here is the problem. Ranked wins are outdated, oversimplified, and often misleading. Now, I definitely think ranked wins are important. It's evidence that your team can beat another solid opponent. However, rankings change every week, and a win over one ranked team early in the season might not hold the same weight later if that team collapses. And conversely, beating an unranked team that finishes the season strong, that win suddenly looks a lot better, even if the rankings don't account for it. This can be clearly seen with Texas beating Michigan early in the year. That looked like a top 10 win, but then obviously now we know Michigan really ended up not being that good. Or Georgia Tech beating Florida State. Again, Florida State went 2-10. Those ranked wins are not that impressive. But there's also games like SMU losing to BYU. That didn't look like a great loss for SMU, but then BYU ended up being a really solid team. So that didn't look that bad on SMU's resume. This is where I think college football should adopt a quadrant system just like college basketball, especially since the playoff has expanded to 12 teams and maybe even more in the future. I think a quadrant system would work a lot better. So within this system, there are quads 1 through 4, with quad 1 being the most valuable. And what I love about this system is that it takes into consideration where the game is played, whether it's a home game, an away game, or even a neutral site game. So in basketball, a quad 1 game is a home game versus a top 30 opponent, a neutral site game versus a top 50 opponent, or an away game versus a top 75 opponent. Quad 2 is a home game versus 31 through 75, neutral versus 51 through 100, and away 76 through 135. So if you play the 100th best team on the road and beat them in basketball, that is a quad 2 win. And then there's quad 3 and quad 4 after that. Now let's apply this to college football. If you beat a top 10 opponent, obviously that's a quad 1 win. But what happens if you beat the number 30 opponent on the road? Now, you're not going to get a ranked win for that because they're ranked number 30 and they're not within the top 25. But beating the 30th best team in the country on the road is still a really solid win. And that would be considered a quad 1 win in college football if you applied this system. Now, obviously, there are less teams in college football than college basketball, and the playoff is much smaller, with 12 teams, whereas in college basketball, it's 64 teams. Because of that, I think these quads need to be a lot smaller, and this is how I would break it up personally. So a quad 1 game is a home game versus a top 25 opponent. So that way you can simply look at the top 25, it's a home game. If you win or lose, it's either a quad 1 win or a quad 1 loss. But then if you move it to a neutral site, it goes to the top 30 teams, an away game goes to the top 40 teams. Quad 2 is home 26 through 45, neutral 31 through 55, away 41 through 67. That's quad 2. Quad 3 is a home game versus 46 through 75, neutral 56 through 85, away 68 through 95, and then quad 4 is a home game versus a team ranked 76 to 134, neutral 86 to 134, or away 96 to 134. With the quad system, we'd get a more accurate picture of a team's resume. Rankings wouldn't simply control the narrative. I think performance would. A team's quality would be judged on who they beat, where they beat them, and how tough their overall schedule is. Now, you'll obviously still have to rank the teams because in order to know which quadrant a game goes into, you have to know the rankings of the opponents. And you would need to rank all 134 FBS teams in order to do this. And another thing I like about this system is that it's always based on the current rankings. So if your opponent falls from the 65th best team to the 75th best team, that win might go from a quad 2 win to a quad 3 win throughout the season. So this would take into account teams like Michigan and Florida State who were highly ranked at the beginning of the year and then by the end of the year weren't highly ranked at all. Or vice versa, a team that started out really low and then worked their way up inside the top 25. Now, I will say this isn't perfect because let's say a team is within that quad 1 and then you beat them and they fall outside quad 1 because you beat them. That doesn't really seem fair that now that it's a quad 2 win, that is one issue with it, and that's also an issue with ranked wins. So it's a common problem with ranked wins and using the quad system. but I think this still gives you an overall better picture than simply looking at ranked wins. And the reason is, if you beat a team that would have been quad 1, but because you beat them, they fall to quad 2, at least you're still getting that quad 2 win on your resume. With ranked wins, there's really only two options. Either one, you count it as a ranked win because they were ranked when you beat them, or two, you don't count it as a ranked win because they fell out of the rankings even though you beat them when they were ranked. I think both ways are flawed, because if you beat a team that is number 24 and they truly are number 24, but they fall out of the top 25 because you beat them, it doesn't seem fair. You don't get a ranked win for that. But you can also look at it the other way that we've already mentioned. If you beat a team that was ranked at one point, but they finished the year 6-6, should you really get a ranked win for that? So like I said, both ways are flawed, but at least with the quadrant system, that win will show up somewhere. Whether it's quad 1, 2, 3, or 4, it's gonna show up on your resume. And because it's always based on current rankings, at one point, let's say you have 3 quad 1 wins, but those teams end up slipping throughout the year, you might finish the year with 0 quad 1 wins. And I think that is a more fair and objective way to do it than simply just giving you a ranked win because you beat a team that was ranked at the time you beat them. I think college football is too great to let subjective and unfair arguments be the reason one team gets into the college football playoff and another team doesn't. That's why I think we should use the quadrant system. It's definitely not perfect, but it gives you a good overview of a team's resume. I think you should still go in and specifically look at the opponents they beat, the teams they lost to, their strength of schedule. If they beat a top 5 team, that's simply going to show up as a quad 1 win, whereas the top 25 team's also going to show up as a quad 1 win. So it doesn't differentiate between teams like that. So you should still go look at each resume specifically. But I think the quad system gives you a good overview. Like I said, it's not perfect. At the end of this video, I'm going to talk about some of the issues more specifically that I would have with this system. But like I said, use this system in addition to looking at each team specifically. Now, with all of that being said, let's go look at the data. I use CBS Sports top 134 rankings where they rank every single FBS team. And then I did the top 18 college football playoff teams and compared their resumes using the quad system. So you're looking at the top 18 teams in the college football playoff rankings. You can see their overall record and then their record broken down into the 4 quadrants. On the right, you can see the quads broken up. So quad 1, 2, and 3, and 4. You can see how they are made up of the home, neutral, and away games. And then the 2 asterisks in the bottom right, based on CBS Sports rankings of all 134 teams, as I said. And then also the FCS teams are always counted as quad 4, just for simplicity. This is updated as of the conference championship games. So you can see Oregon, Georgia, Texas, and all the other teams that went to the conference championships. They have all played 13 games. So I think this is a super interesting way of looking at these teams' resumes. The first 4 teams, I don't think there's anything too crazy to look at. It's pretty standard. Oregon's undefeated, 5 quad 1 wins. That is the most out of any team on here. Georgia 4-2 in quad 1. That's very good. Texas, who a lot of people did say that their schedule was actually pretty weak. You can see they only went 2-2 in quad 1, but undefeated in the rest of the quadrants. Penn State, 2-2 in quad 1 as well, and then obviously undefeated in the rest of the quadrants. Notre Dame is where it gets interesting. 3-0 in quad 1, 3-0 in quad 2, 2-0 in quad 3, and then randomly 3-1 in quad 4. And obviously that's that NIU loss they had early in the year, which is probably the biggest and most confusing upset of the entire season. Number 6, Ohio State, they are the first team or the highest rated team with a quad 2 loss. That's obviously that Michigan loss, which was also very confusing, still not nearly as bad as that NIU loss for Notre Dame. And I think that Michigan upset over Ohio State is where you can see the value in this quadrant system. It is recorded as a quad 2 loss for Ohio State. Michigan finished number 40th in the CBS Sports rankings, so that means it is a home game against the 40th best team in the country for Ohio State, which is registered as a quad 2 loss. But once we get to Indiana, Boise State, SMU, Alabama, that's where it gets really, really interesting because you can start comparing those teams that were on the bubble. And we all know in the playoff discussion, the last spot came down to SMU and Alabama. But when looking at this quad system, SMU's resume does not look too bad at all. They're 2-2 in quad 1, 2-0 in quad 2, 3-0 in quad 3, and 4-0 in quad 4. Alabama's 4-1 in quad 1. Obviously, that's one of the best quad 1 resumes on here. But then you have the 2 quad 2 losses, which are obviously Vanderbilt and Oklahoma. And then they're 3-0 in quad 3, 2-0 in quad 4. And you may look at Alabama's 2 quad 2 losses and think one of two things. One, you might be surprised that their 2 losses are in the quad 2, and that would be because Vanderbilt and Oklahoma are ranked 55 and 57 respectively in CBS Sports rankings, and because those were both away games for Alabama, those fall into quad 2. If they had been home games, those would fall into quad 3. But you can see the value in that because obviously Alabama would have much rather played those teams at home, especially Oklahoma. So that could be the first way you look at it, is that you're surprised they only fall into quad 2 and not quad 3 or quad 4. But the second way you can look at it, and I think this is the more correct way to look at it, is you compare it to the rest of the field here. There are only 2 teams on here in the top 18 with at least 2 quad 2 losses, and they are Alabama and Iowa State, who is the 18th team on here. So when you look at it that way, you can see how that could seriously hurt Alabama in the playoff discussion, because nobody else had more than 1 quad 2 loss other than them and Iowa State. I think this does a really good job of capturing Alabama's really good wins with the 4-1 quad 1 record, but then also their bad losses where they're 0-2 in quad 2 and nobody else has more than 1 quad 2 loss other than Iowa State. The only other team on here that has a quad 4 loss other than Notre Dame is Ole Miss. You can see that 4-1 quad 4 record. That quad 4 loss is to Kentucky, which is also just another baffling loss because Kentucky only beat 1 Power 4 team, and it was Ole Miss. But here is the number 1 team on here that I want to point out, and it's Indiana. We have heard the talk that Indiana got a very, very favorable schedule, but you probably heard it more about SMU and other teams that were on the bubble, looking on the outside in or on the inside, but potentially getting bumped out like SMU, Alabama. And we heard the argument saying if Indiana loses to Ohio State, they should not be in the playoff. I said that myself, but obviously that was before the chaos in the SEC where Alabama, A&M, and Ole Miss all lost in the same week. That kind of opened it up for Indiana. But their game against Ohio State was not close. You can see that is the only quad 1 game that they played. They're 0-1 quad 1. They're 1-0 in quad 2, which is against Michigan. The remaining 10 of their games were all in either quad 3 or quad 4. They're 5-0 in quad 3 and 5-0 in quad 4. So 10 of their 12 games were in the bottom 2 quadrants. They only played 2 games in quad 2 and quad 1. And they lost the 1 in quad 1 to Ohio State, and it wasn't very close. Now, Indiana can't really help that too much. Like, they just happened to play a horrible in-conference schedule that resulted in this resume. But even though it's not their fault, it's something we should definitely still take into consideration when we're looking at the playoff. I'm not saying they shouldn't have made the playoff because, like I said, a bunch of teams ended up losing that opened it up for Indiana. But should Boise be ahead of them? Should SMU be ahead of them? Should Alabama be ahead of them? That's the question. And it just was kind of crazy to see that 10 of their 12 games were in either quad 3 or quad 4. That's more than Boise State, who plays in the Mountain West. Only 9 of Boise State's 13 games were in the quad 3 or quad 4. However, Boise State did play the most quad 4 games out of anyone on here with 7, which again makes sense because they do play in the Mountain West. So I found that super interesting looking at each team's quad 1 games, quad 2, quad 3, quad 4, how many they played in each quadrant, how many wins, how many losses. Like I said, I think it's a really good overview of their resume, and you can see their really good wins as well as their really bad losses. Now, I said earlier in the video I was going to talk about some of the complaints or the issues I could still see with this system being in place. Number 1, it does not differentiate between, a top 5 win and the number 24 team if you beat them, right? It's still going to be a quad 1 win regardless, even though number 3 is probably a lot better than number 25, but those wins would show up the same as simply a quad 1 win. And that's why I said it's great to use this system in addition to looking at each team specifically, each team individually, and looking at their games and their resume. Because obviously a top 5 win is more impressive than beating the number 24 team or the number 25 team. And so you would want to take that into consideration. Number 2, and we already mentioned it, but it's a similar problem that ranked wins has. If you beat a team that is, let's say, quad 1, and because you beat them, they fall to quad 2, it doesn't seem fair that you're now getting a quad 2 win. There is a little benefit of that if you lose, like let's say to a quad 2 opponent, but because they beat you, they end up moving into the quad 1. Then it's a quad 1 loss instead of a quad 2. So at least you have that, which does not work with ranked wins and losses. And then lastly, this system does not show you point differential. So Alabama, for example, they have a quad 2 loss, which is at Oklahoma. And that game was a loss by 21 points. So it's not simply just, oh, a quad 2 loss. It's like a bad quad 2 loss. Like you wasn't even close. And so that doesn't show up obviously in this system either. But again, I've said it a million times. That's why you look at each team specifically and individually in addition to using this system. So I think the quadrant system would honestly revolutionize the way we look at college football teams, especially in the 12-team playoff era. And if we move to 16 teams, 24 teams, because that's looking likely at this point, I think this would be a fantastic system to help seed and rank these teams. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm going to start making more real life college football content. I have a little bit, going to probably dive into it even more. So definitely like if you enjoy it, subscribe if you're enjoying it. Follow me on Instagram at TubbyCFB. That's right, we changed the name. Finally, we're going by TubbyCFB. It's going to be the mix of college football video game news with College Football 26 obviously coming out this summer, as well as real life college football.